Good morning, church. Great to be with you all today. Thank you for joining us online. Today we're actually starting a brand new sermon series where we're going to be looking at the life of one of the greatest prophets to have ever lived. His name is Elijah. And when he bursts onto the scene, he bursts on in such a dramatic way. And if you like any story that shows the power of God, you're going to love this story about Elijah the prophet. The only problem is we know very little about Elijah. Very little at all. I mean, we know he's a Tishbite, which means he's from Tishba in Gilead. Gilead is actually east of the Jordan River. It's in modern-day Jordan today. That's about all we know. But it does tell us in James chapter 5:17 another fascinating fact about Elijah when it calls him a man with a nature like ours. A man with a nature like ours. The King James translation said he was a man of like passions. Simply meaning he was like you, he was like me. Yeah, Elijah had his ups and downs. We're going to see that as we go through his story. He was far from perfect. I mean, he had a bad temper. He was prone to depression and discouragement, like many of us are. But James uses him and his life as an example for us to follow because in spite of his human weaknesses, he was a man of prayer who walked with God in the midst of an evil generation. And he saw God do some amazing things in and through his life. So I want to set this story up today. The book of Kings, which we're going to be looking at today, is actually a story about how Israel literally fell apart. They fell into pieces. It tells the story of how Israel went from being a strong, united kingdom under the reign of King David. Everybody remembers him. Then when King David dies, he puts his son Solomon in position as king. And he makes sure Solomon knows that he's to keep his agreement with God, that God will be their God and the people will be his people. David had made that kind of agreement. He says, Solomon, you've got to keep that agreement, but then things get kind of messed up, start changing for the worse. Solomon starts out real well. You remember he built the amazing Solomon's temple, but eventually Solomon becomes totally corrupt by his own power. He becomes the wealthiest person in the world. And he's supposed to be the wisest person in the world. I'm not sure that's true because he ends up marrying 700 wives, having 300 concubines from all these neighboring countries. And, you know, that presents another problem, 1,000 mother-in-laws. Can you imagine that? Need I say more? Probably not. But think about these women. They worship their false gods, even bringing them into God's nation, and built altars for the people to also worship those false gods, really giving the whole nation over to idolatry. Then Solomon dies, and when he dies, there's this power struggle that takes place, and this once powerful united kingdom splits in two different kingdoms. You've got the northern kingdom called Israel. Then you've got the southern kingdom known as Judah. So basically, you've got the north versus the south, so to speak. And whenever any new king would step on the throne, it was found out that they were more evil, more wicked, worse than the king that came before them. It was kind of a process that kept taking place over and over and over again. And in the span of 200 years, out of the 40 kings that they had, there were only, believe it or not, about 8 that were considered somewhat good. In fact, the northern kingdom went 0 for 20 as far as good and godly kings. Kind of sounds a little bit like the Chicago Cubs, just saying. And the southern kingdom went 8 for 20. You might say they were maybe more like the St. Louis Cardinals. I knew I'd get some of you fired up over that one. So there was a lot of corruptness. There was a lot of ungodliness going on. Obviously, Patriot fans would understand a little bit about that. I'm kidding again. I got on a sports roll there. But I want to start out by looking at the kings of the north. Starts off with a man by the name of Jeroboam. He started out as one of Solomon's officials in the beginning, but he becomes king of the north later on, and we find out right away he's not a good king. We know Jeroboam's not a good king because the first thing he does is set up 2 golden calves to be worshipped. And so Jeroboam introduces the nation of Israel to idol worship, and he brings down the wrath of God on the whole nation. And from there it spirals downward. And there becomes a common theme when it describes or introduces a new king in the Bible. Almost every time it would say, and so the new king did evil in the eyes of the Lord, following the ways of his father and committing the same sin his father had caused Israel to commit. So just to give you a quick review or a quick history of what's going on, we kind of tend to gloss over these scriptures on the book of 1 Kings, but it's actually telling us the story of what king is in power against what king, and it kind of sets up our whole text today. But we're starting off with Jeroboam. We'll call him King Jerry. As soon as he becomes king, as I said, he sets up these pagan idols to worship. That's bad. And then his son Nadab becomes king after him. He was also evil. Then this other king by the name of Baasha steps up, who was assassinated after only 2 years. He was also evil. Baasha had a son. Elah was his name. He was also an evil king. Then this man Zimri, it says, who was also one of Elah's officials, actually killed Elah and his whole family. So let's just say right there, there's no honor, there's no loyalty anywhere in Israel at that time. Look what it says in 1 Kings 16:15. It says, Zimri reigned only 7 days. This King Zimri reigned for only 7 days. I'm thinking that's hardly long enough to change the curtains in the palace. Then after Zimri's death, Omri becomes king. I'm going to call him Omri the Onri because he was. Look at verse 25. But Omri did evil in the eyes of the Lord and sinned more than all those before him. Omri didn't care one bit about the spiritual condition of God's people. In fact, he was driving them further away from God. Saying all this, it brings me to where I really want to start today. It says, Omri had a son named Ahab. Remember that name, Ahab, who becomes king of the north. Look how the Bible introduces us to Ahab. It says in verse 30, Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. So think about this. It goes from bad to worse. Ahab is worse than them all. He's more wicked, he's more evil, he's more corrupt, and now he has taken the whole nation over the cliff in immorality and idolatry. And it looks totally spiritually hopeless for Israel. And to make matters worse, Ahab marries a woman by the name of Jezebel, who turns out to be as evil, if not more evil, than Ahab. And she's on a mission to get the people to stop worshiping the God of the Bible and to actually start instead worshiping her false gods of Baal and Asherah. And if you know anything about their worship, it was totally disgusting. When I say disgusting, I mean they were sacrificing their own children to these false gods. They engaged in all sorts of lewd behavior, even in the temple, believe it or not. I mean, it was just so wicked. So I would say you could definitely say there was a spiritual drought that was happening in Israel at that time. Now, out of nowhere, something is about to happen. God's about to step on the scene. He's not going to come in the form of an army. He's going to do it through a man, one man. Look at chapter 17, verse 1. It says, Now Elijah, the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead, said to Ahab. So Elijah, this prophet of God, basically comes out of nowhere. No one knows who he is, where he's come from. But in one of my commentaries, I read that his name, believe it or not, literally means the Lord is my God. I've got a graphic here to show you about the breakdown of his name. The letters L actually mean God. The letter I means my. And Jah means Jehovah or Yahweh. Basically, the Lord is my God. Go back to verse 1 again. Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, As the Lord the God of Israel lives. Think about this. That's a smack in the face of King Ahab for sure. Because Elijah is saying, King Ahab, my God's alive. How about yours? He says, As the Lord the God of Israel lives, whom I serve. So Elijah, again, is telling Ahab exactly where he stands spiritually. Then he says this, There will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word. I'm thinking, wow. Think about Elijah. He's standing before the most powerful and the most evil king, the most evil man in the world at that time. And he basically says, King Ahab, this spiritual drought that you brought on you and your people, it's going to lead to God getting ready to put on you a physical drought. So what's happening here is Elijah is saying, you worship the God of rain, I'm going to show you who's really in charge of the rain. How many have ever seen that show Seinfeld? Anybody watch that show? Remember that episode where they had the soup Nazi? Where the soup Nazi, the chef, got mad at everyone and he said, no soup for you. Well, Elijah's basically saying this to Ahab. No rain for you, King Ahab. It was a big slap in the face because this Baal, this false god, was considered to be the god of rain. If you've ever seen an image or a picture of Baal, he's usually standing with his arms up over his head with a lightning bolt in his hands because he's depicted as the god of weather. And back then the weather was everything. I mean, the people would worship Baal in hopes that he would bring rain for their crops. He would also keep the wind and the hail and the storms away from their crops. So to break this down, Elijah is basically saying to Ahab, for the next few years, there will be no rain. And if that's not bad enough, there's not even going to be any dew. So to equate what he's saying with our world today, it'd be like him saying, hey, you can go to the gas station, but you're not going to be able to get any gas. The banks are not going to be lending any money. You're not even going to be able to withdraw your own money from the bank. You won't have electricity in your home. He's basically saying life as you've known it is gone. It's no more. There's going to be people starving to death. Unemployment's going to be sky high. People are going to be dying all over the place. And here this man of God stands before this evil king and says, hey, no more rain. So God's going to put his people definitely through some hardships to snap them back into understanding that he and he alone is God. And just so you get this right, sometimes God may use a crisis to get your attention. Does that mean we've done some big sin? We've committed some big sin, done something wrong? Not necessarily. Think of Jesus. Jesus went through some hardships more than anyone else, yet the Bible says he was perfect and sinless. What I'm saying, it's not always because we have sin in our lives or we've committed some kind of wrong. Sometimes God uses hardships to get our attention. I also want to point this out about Elijah. He doesn't show up after the fact to say, this is why God brought the drought on you all. He announces it beforehand, before it even happens. And by the way, that was a sure sign that he was a real true man of God, a real prophet of God. I mean, the Bible's pretty clear on this. There's only one true test for a prophet. And it's this: if somebody comes along and they claim to be speaking for God, and they predict that something will happen and it doesn't happen, their law was that they would be taken out and stoned. That sounds a little harsh, right? Maybe not. Actually, it kept the false prophets at bay for sure. So Elijah, think about it. He's declaring it long before it happens. And it's not some vague message that could mean 1,000 different things. No, it was specific. God was really getting ready to prove that Baal never produced one drop of rain that people had taken for granted years and years and years. Scripture never tells us the king's reaction to what Elijah was saying, or what his thoughts were, what his words were. I think he's probably just standing there with his mouth dropped open, dumbfounded, thinking about, who's this guy? I mean, where'd he come from? I mean, how dare he show up and say such things? I think the next few verses, God even has some words that surprise Elijah. Listen to these words starting in verse 2. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, leave here, turn east, and hide in the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have directed the ravens to supply you with food there. So I'm thinking God's telling Elijah, I want you to do two things. I want you to depart, and I want you to depend. Elijah, right now, you need to depart from where you are, and you need to start depending upon me 100%. And I believe he actually got this message from God while he was standing right in front of King Ahab. And, you know, if you're like me, you're thinking, man, I'm ready for a big showdown between Elijah and the power of God over King Ahab. Well, it doesn't happen. God tells him to depart, to leave, and to follow him, to actually trust in him. In verse 4, God says, you will drink from the brook, and I have directed the ravens to supply you with food there. So think about Elijah. He's going in the boldness of the Lord, certainly not in his own boldness, but in the boldness of the Lord. And he stands before the king with this powerful proclamation of faith. And then God commands him to go hide. Doesn't make much sense. But if you know the story, and when you're thinking about it, if this drought, when it got worse, King Ahab is going to become more irritated, and for sure he's going after Elijah to punish Elijah. But I'm thinking, God could have protected him without even hiding him. So when I read this, I'm thinking, wait a minute, God might be up to something else. I believe this might be the depend part. God's saying, Elijah, this is where you start depending upon me. God commands Elijah to hide so that he can prove himself to Elijah. Look at verse 5. So he did what the Lord had told him. I'm sure it didn't make any sense at all, but he did what the Lord had told him. He went to the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan, and stayed there. I don't care who you are, that took some faith. Faith to believe that God was going to do this unbelievable miracle. Faith to believe that Elijah was going to be part of this unbelievable miracle, even if it didn't make any sense. How many times have you found out that when it comes to God, it doesn't always have to make sense? Many times it doesn't. My favorite definition of faith comes from Pastor Philip Yancey, who said, faith means believing in advance what will only make sense in reverse. Did you get that? Faith means believing in advance what will only make sense in reverse. What will only make sense sometimes when you look back. I mean, think about it. Wouldn't it be great if God gave us some forewarning before hard times hit? Wouldn't that be great? It'd give us a time to mentally prepare for it, to get ready for it. Well, that's not what faith is about. Faith is not knowing and trusting God through it no matter what you're dealing with. That's faith. Then you can look back and you see God's hand was with me the whole time. How many of you have ever been there, gone through a situation, and then after the fact you look back and think, God, I didn't even think you were there, but you were with me every step of the way. Look at verse 6. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. When I first read this, I'm thinking, that sounds pretty good. Man, I think I'll just quit my job, wait for a raven to fly through the window in the morning, deliver breakfast, fly through the window in the evening, deliver supper. Pretty good deal. But think about it. He describes it as a raven. That's a scavenger bird. Think about that. It'd be like having a buzzard, or around here, a turkey vulture deliver your breakfast. Have you ever seen what they eat? That'd be a little disgusting. But I think it all boils down to the power of God. Think about how much power God has. How God can move in the heart of a creature like a raven. And He can get this raven to deliver, to drop off to Elijah exactly what he needs in just the right amount. No leftovers. You know, it would have been maybe an ancient form of drone delivery. The first form of drone delivery. God even had the edge on that. But when I think about this whole story, I wonder why God couldn't have just told Elijah to go home and hide out. Maybe it's because that wasn't God's perfect will for Elijah. It wasn't for him to hide out at home. It wasn't for him to go check into a nice hotel room. It was for him to check into the unknown, basically, so he could trust God. Think about this. God put Elijah in a place that the only person he had out there to fellowship with was God Himself. The only person he had to depend upon was God Himself. You know, we all know, because many of us have been there, God takes us to places that we really don't want to be. But when we get there, we find out it's the best place to be. Think about this whole story. During this drought, other people were running out of water. Elijah had plenty. Other people were starving to death. Elijah was getting 2 square meals a day. Let me ask you, would Elijah have learned as much about the faithfulness of God if he had gone home and hid out at home? I don't think so. I think, like our homes, there would have been too many distractions. That's why I love what Jesus says in John chapter 15, verse 2. Jesus says, He, meaning God, cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does not bear fruit, He prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. You know, sometimes God's putting us through a pruning process. Maybe God had to take Elijah out of his own comfort zone to cut away anything that might have been holding him back from what God wanted to do in his life. Today, that could be true in our lives. Maybe your normal routine of every day is actually stopping the flow of what God really wants to do in your life. And you'll think about it. Maybe it's okay that sometimes God allows us to get in situations where we're a little bit uncomfortable, especially if it's about growing us in our dependence and our trust in Him. Verse 7 tells us that sometime later the brook dried up. Why did that happen? I think the reason that happened is Elijah was learning to trust God totally, completely, unconditionally. And whenever he needed to know the next step, God would be right there to give him the next step. Amen? This is what I think the first part of this whole Elijah story is all about. It's about not knowing the whole story. It's about not having to know the whole story and still trusting God in the middle of it. Think about that. And sometimes the hardest part of trusting is waiting upon God. Think of Elijah. He was where he was by God's command, and he was determined to stay where God wanted him to stay until God told him to move on. I don't know about you, but I know when we go on a long trip, I like to have a GPS with me so I can know where I'm at all times. I can know where I'm going, what lies ahead. I heard one man say that when God tries to show us His will for our lives, sometimes He gives us a flashlight, not a road map. We're given just enough light to see into the darkness, just enough to take that next step. But instead of a map or a GPS, God's giving us a flashlight. And I believe He's basically saying, hey, you've got to trust me and just take the next step, whatever it is. Think about our story today. When God calls Elijah to take this message to Ahab, and then He tells him to go hide in the ravine. You know what I think He's doing? He's giving Elijah a flashlight. He's letting him see just a little bit of the journey. Not the whole journey, just a little bit. Think about this. Did Elijah know how long he was going to be there when this whole thing started? No. When God told him to hide in the ravine, did he know where he was going to go to next? No. Did Elijah have any idea that soon he would be having this big showdown with the prophets of Baal? No. Did Elijah know that one day he would be calling down fire from heaven? No. You know, with that said, so many of Elijah's greatest scenes are yet to unfold in his life. And he didn't even have a clue that they were coming, and he definitely wasn't demanding that they would come. What he was doing was putting his whole trust and his whole dependency in his God and doing it one step at a time. One step at a time. I love the story in the Old Testament where it talks about when Moses wants to see God's glory, and he asked to see God's glory. He wanted a sign, like many of us do. And God was pleased with Moses, and God agreed to it. He said, Moses, you can see me. You can't see my face because His glory is too powerful. It would kill someone. But anyway, look what God tells Moses in Exodus 33, verse 21. He says, there is a place near me where you may stand on a rock. When my glory passes by, I will put you in the cleft in the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will remove my hand and you will see my back, but my face must not be seen. Think about it. Moses did what he was instructed to do. He stood in that crevice of the rock, and God passed by, and this time in human form. And Moses saw Him. Not His face, but he saw His back. Think about that. I was thinking about that. Why would Moses see his back? I believe it's because God was leading the way. That's why we need to see God's back, because we're letting Him lead the way one step at a time. The greatest thing that you and I could do is wait upon God. Let Him lead and then follow Him. Just like with Elijah, following Jesus is a journey that happens one step at a time. Even when God tells us what He's going to do, most of the time He doesn't tell us exactly how He's going to do it. He calls us to trust Him, right? Even in the dark. Stepping forward even though we can't see the rest of the path. He's just saying, trust me with this step. And then trust me with this step. And keep your eyes fixed upon God, listening for His voice to guide you for the next step. The question I want to close with today, are there any of you out there today that are struggling to trust God for your next step? Are there any of you struggling to trust God in some circumstance you're dealing with right now? If you are, don't feel alone, because you're not. We've all been there. Many of us are there right now. I know when it comes to me, trusting God means dragging my own will in line with God's will, no matter what I feel. It's actually making a conscious decision to stand on what is true, according to God, not what I feel is true. So today, as we close in prayer, I want you to remember today that He's concerned with more than just your immediate moment, your immediate needs. He wants to do a work in you. He wants you to yield your heart and your life to Him to do a work greater than you could ever even imagine. He wants to help you grow and mature in Him. He wants to forgive you of some sins. He wants to correct some mistakes in your life to prepare you for greater blessings. And maybe He's going to do it one step at a time. Maybe He's going to answer your prayer one step at a time. So how about stop the obsessing on having to know the full plan of God, because that's not His plan. That's not His design. All we have to know from Elijah's story is to take the next step. Listen to the step God is calling us to. You don't have to know the full story, but be willing to listen and willing to obey, willing to take the next step. Could you bow your hearts in prayer with me? Father God, I pray that you would help us to trust you with all the next steps of our lives. Help us to depend upon you for your perfect plan, for your perfect provision for our lives. And Lord, help us to always remember that even Elijah was just a person like we are, yet you used him to do incredible things for your kingdom. Father, I ask that you would use us to do mighty things for you, for your kingdom, for your glory, and for your praise. In Jesus' mighty name I pray. And everyone said, amen. God bless you all. Love you. Have a wonderful week. Have a safe week. See you next week.